Hello, John Bloodworth, Gentleman Crafter here with another adventure in machine embroidery. This time around I wanted to combine a few of the automatic and manual digitizing features of the Hatch embroidery digitizing software. So I started a new project, set my machine and hoop size, and then imported the design that I'm going to digitize, which would be the flower. Now this part I'm going to manually digitize. Once I've got it set to size, or the size that I wanted, I locked that layer so that I didn't risk moving it. For the first part, I'm going to digitize the flower itself, and I'm going to use the freehand closed shape tool. I've chosen a stitch type and a colour, and I'm just zooming in using the zoom tool, and then using that freehand closed shape tool I quickly trace out the shape of that flower bud. I go into the Reshape tool to change the angle of the stitching. And I think what I was trying to do here was just get a loose sketched feel. So I'm basically spacing out that stitching by changing the spacing. And then I'm taking away the underlay so that I'm just left with that top stitching. I turned off the travel on edge so that it didn't flatten out the outside points. Next up, I went for the Digitize Blocks tool, and this was to do the flute of the flower here. I kind of decided really though that I don't think it was going to work the way I wanted because I couldn't really taper that end. So I still had to play around with the settings to see if it would look right or work. But in the end, nope. So I went for the freehand closed shape tool again and just loosely traced around the shape of the entire flower. This tool is the one where you basically left click to start, drag your mouse around like it's a pen, or in fact if you've got a pen and a pen tablet you can actually draw, and the stitching will follow your shape as closely as possible. You can go in and reshape this a little later on using the different nodes, adding, detracting, or even just moving around. I'm not going for accuracy here, I'm going for an impression. Now each time I move a node, the software recalculates that stitching. Changing the spacing again here to try and achieve what I did with the flower bud. And I decided in the end to actually try out the ripple stitch for this because it gives a wonderful effect, especially on irregular shapes like this. Now I was happy with that, but I think I wanted sort of an extra layer for the head of the flower, so I duplicated the flower head, tried out the stipple single run, but went back to the ripple. Using the Reshape tool, I repositioned the center of that ripple. Tried deleting off some of the bottom points and changing the stitch type, but it was going in the wrong direction for me, so I decided actually what I'm going to do is hide the previous layer and just go ahead, because it was so quick, and just redigitize the flower head. Now the stitching won't be exactly on top of each other, and to be honest that's not a problem, because at the end of the day that will help reduce stitch density on that outline. Again I went for the ripple stitch and moved that starting point, or the center point, to where the flower is going into the tube, or trumpet, that's the word, of the flower head. Still not quite there. What I did was I digitized what would be the front if we were looking at it in 3 dimensions. So the front few petals. And then just moving that center point to where it's closest to the center of the flower. And I liked how this was going, so kind of just went with it. I wasn't sure if I was going to change the color of the back layers of the flower or not. So I was basically fiddling around. There's quite a bit of this when you get into software like this. With so many things that you can change, you can spend hours fiddling and refining. I'm kind of just trying to get a look where my eyes say yay. Or as somebody once said to me, your eye taste buds. I'm not sure they're a thing, but we'll go with it. Now, by hiding the artwork, I was able to see better what the stitching would look like, and it works fine for me, so I'm going to go with it. I locked all of those layers in place and got myself set up to digitize the stems and the leaves. This time around I wanted to stay a bit truer to the outline of the shapes, so I went with the digitized closed shape rather than the freehand. That way I could use my mouse to either set a straight point or a curved point. And again, with the Reshape tool, you can go back in and adjust anything that doesn't quite look right to you. Changing the stitch angle there and applying a Florentine effect to give that stitching some curve. Changing the spacing, removing the underlay, underlay, and again playing with that Florentine effect until I'm happy. It looks good, it's got a nice flow to it. So onwards with another leaf, or the other leaf, there are only 2. Now believe it or not, this actually took me less than, I think it was half an hour to do. I have sped the video up just a little bit, just to shave off a few minutes. Excuse me. But yes, it took me around half an hour to fully digitize and send over to the machine to stitch out. So you can see how quickly things come together. And you'll remember that for the end of the video, because you'll see how much stitching is actually involved. I think what I was trying to gain from this was the fact that by spending the time digitizing the important elements, or manually digitizing the important elements of a design, and then using automatic features for things like the background or unimportant aspects, that actually it's working smarter rather than harder. I mean, that was the plan. My screen recording software obviously gives a different colour to the rings that pop out from the cursor each time I click. The red is a left click and the yellow is a right click. So you can see I'm mixing up those straight and curved corner points. Now with the stem complete, it's on to the obligatory fiddling. There should just be a fiddling button really, I guess, that just opens up all the options, but there you go. Using the Florentine effect again here, just to really try and give the stitching some direction that makes sense in terms of the bend of the stalks. And I decided to change the stitch spacing to match all of the elements. And of course resequencing to make sure that things that would be at the front are in fact at the front. So next up I was trying to understand or get an idea of what, if any, outlines I should do. So I duplicated everything, changed it to an outline and applied a dark colour to see what result it would give or what benefit it would give, if any. Just changing the sequencing to see if positioning the stitching behind or in front would make a difference. In the end, I decided that it was, let's just say, rubbish. It just didn't really add anything to the design. All it was adding was extra stitches. So despite fiddling and trying my best to make it work, I just deleted them. No thread lost, no stitching time used, all done. Now I hid one of the artwork layers, selected all of the floral element and moved it around. I changed to the manual center of the hoop because every time I move the design, obviously the hoop is moving as well. Then I imported this crazy background and used the auto digitizing photo stitch to basically come up with an awesome background. Now there's a lot of stitching going on in there, probably around 20,000 stitches I think it was in the end. So I thought actually if I can delete a couple of these layers and still have the same effect, then I will shave off quite a few stitches. So I tried all sorts of combos to see what worked, and I ended up with 4 colours. Probably could have got away with 3, but I wanted the graduation from the dark to the light. Just saving out the EMB file now so that I've got the original A grade to come back to, and then of course I would need to export the design as a PES file because I have a Brother embroidery machine. The difference being is the EMB file is basically for the Hatch software only, and the PES file is for the embroidery machine. Now in the threads palette, I'm going to basically use the colours that I've got available to me and change those colours so that I know what I'm going to be stitching out on the machine. Will of course mean re-exporting the design, but hey ho. Now I have noticed that on screen the colours don't always match or look true to what they are in real life, so I always make sure that I'm eyeballing the colours that I'm going to be using just so that I can be 100% sure they'll work in real life. I ended up deciding that the flower would be all white. I think the stitching helps really just give it the detail that it needs. So resaving the EMB file and then obviously re-exporting the PES file. Now, one last thing to do before I stitch it out for reels is just run it through the stitch player in the software. This is so that I can really get an idea of what order things are stitching out, whether that's going to give it any issues. Of course, you can watch it in real time if you want, according to your machine's stitch speed, but the stitch player does have a speed scroller, so you can increase the speed and watch it much faster. Or you can even use the slider where the colours are, just to really scroll through and make sure things are how you would want them. I decided just to jack up the speed. Whee! If only I did this in real life. Now, although I was happy with the final stitched result, having the 4 colours on this background did kind of make it quite densely stitched. So again, in the future I might just try and get away with 2 colours, or even just actually 1 might work. Just this sort of outer frame area. If your machine has a stitch limitation in terms of the number of stitches it can do, this kind of design does take up a lot of stitches. I think this background ended up being 20,000 of the 30,000 total stitches. So, as I say, if you have got a stitch limitation, just be aware of that. You can always see the stitch count towards the bottom right on the panel of information that's kind of blue. Here comes the flower. Whee! It's a fascinating one to watch stitch out, but it does take a long time, around 90 minutes in all, so it's definitely one to set and forget. And there we have the finished result. I hope you've enjoyed watching.